Welcome back to the channel Black is One, where the agenda is to elevate the consciousness of the black race so we can unite, build, and prosper. Today I'm going to be answering a two-part FAQ. How would black people survive without white people? And why is there no example of any self-sustaining, thriving black community anywhere?
How would black people survive on this planet if white people didn't exist? Now, some people might think of this as a joke, but this is actually a very serious question. There is nowhere on this planet an example of a self-sustaining and successful and thriving black community.
I saw this question on YouTube and I thought that I would write a response article, which I'm going to read. You see, these questions can be very difficult to answer. Detractors of the African cause tend to pose these questions as some kind of kryptonite to paralyze the Pan-Africanist who is not a good debater or who may not be exposed to certain historical material. But don't worry, I will help you to answer these frequently asked questions. Now, I have elected to use the question as the title of my article, of my essay, so to speak. Is white people a necessity or an hindrance to black people's survival? Now here we go. When someone premeditates a crime against an innocent person, there are at least three conditions that the perpetrator seeks to satisfy. First, he needs to figure out how to get away with the crime, meaning how to avoid the consequences. Second, because the victim is innocent, he has to overcome his own conscience to follow through with the crime. And third, he has to come up with a narrative, a story to justify his actions in the court of public opinion. Now, the criminals involved in the orchestration and commission of one of the most egregious crimes against humanity, the transatlantic European slave trade, or the Christian slave trade, that trafficked over 12.5 million kidnapped Africans to the Americas, developed their own crime plan using these three steps. One of the narratives they have concocted to suppress their own conscience before committing the crime, as well as to dilute their guilt after committing those crimes, is that the evils they have done to the Africans was necessary, not for themselves, but for the victims. They claim that Europeans, through the crimes of slavery and colonization, saved the black people, that we were in Africa malnourished, stupid and savage, just running wild and killing each other. So when the white man came to the continent and enslaved us, enslavement was horrible, they will admit, but it was a blessing, because had they not come, we would have either starved or killed each other to the point of extinction. This narrative is over 400 years old, handed down from mother to daughter, from father to son. It is a psychological defense mechanism that is still being used by the present generation of white folks who want to continue to reap the benefits but avoid the consequences of what their forefathers have done. So when you hear someone ask with condescension questions like, how would black people have survived without white people? And why aren't there any thriving independent black communities anywhere? Often you're dealing with a troll, but sometimes you are dealing with a delusional character, someone who is 100% out of touch with reality and ignorant of history. Now that the question has been contextualized, how do we, the defenders of the African cause, respond to these questions? I have elected to answer this question in two ways. First, I will show that contact between our ancestors and theirs from the African point of view was the most regrettable incident in all of our history. It has no good outcomes. It carries no advantage. And second, I will show that the things Europeans claim to have imparted to Africans were in fact vice versa. It was Africa that gave those things to Europe. At the macro level, the consequences of Europeans turning up on the shores of Africa are monumental, to say the least. Had it not been for the extraordinary tenacity of the Africans and the topography of the African continent, we would have suffered a similar fate as the Kalinagos or the Caribs and the Tainos in the Caribbean, the Aztecs in North America. and the Aboriginals in Australia when they came into contact with the white man. Our fate would have been extinction. The historical records are there to show that white Christians took 12.5 million Africans out of their homeland, men, women, and children, to be worked to death for some 300 years. According to the Ghanaian president Nana Akufo-Addo, in presenting a case for reparation, he said that European enslavers made 38,000 voyages across the Atlantic. Those voyages carried human cargo, black people in chains below deck, to the Americas, where the proceeds from their forced labor funded the white man's empires: Britain, France, Spain, Portugal, Italy, Belgium, Sweden, and so on. The real question then ought not to be how would black people survive without white people, but rather how did black people survive white people? The gravity of that atrocity, called the transatlantic slave trade, cannot be processed by the human mind. It cannot be expressed on paper. And bear in mind that 12.5 million is the perpetrator's estimate, and criminals tend to downplay their crimes when they stand before a jury. If 12.5 million is their estimate, I think the correct figure is more like 25 million. However, for the sake of argument, let's use 12.5 million. That figure only accounts for those who made it to the Americas alive. Another 12.5 million died in Africa on their way to the slave ships. They died from hunger, thirst, disease, stress, and sheer sadness. Another 2 million died on the ships en route to the Americas, who were thrown overboard and are now buried under the Atlantic Ocean. That's depopulation of Africa to the tune of at least 27 million people. With these being the facts, without even touching on the conditions of enslavement when they landed in the Americas, how can any European insinuate that without them, black people would not have survived? Far from being an act of salvation as they claim, the day Europe made contact with Africa was the most regrettable moment in the history of Africans from the Africans' point of view. And it gets worse. Having enslaved our ancestors and tortured us for some 300 years, they still were not satisfied. After slavery ended in the Americas in the early to mid 19th century, Europeans returned to the continent of Africa, a continent now weak from systematically being stripped of its ablest human resources for 300 years. They colonized all of it except for Ethiopia and enslaved the population in their homeland for nearly 100 years. They held the people at gunpoint and forced them to mine their own gold and other resources, load them on ships by the millions of tons, and send them to Europe. How did that assist black people's survival? Even after slavery and colonization ended, their legacies still haunted the African race. For example, racism, which remains a yoke upon the black race, was a gift from the white man. This idea of classifying people according to skin color, then rank them on a scale where white people are at the very top and black people at the very bottom, then making it international law, which has caused black people to be mistreated, hated, sabotaged, and oppressed in every country, is the genius of the white man. No machine can compute the redress owed to the black man for the damages he has incurred over the last 400 to 500 years because of this manufactured, omnipresent social pathogen called racism. Racism has infected even the black population, which has resulted in a lot of self-hate, self-sabotage, and even outright conflicts, as was the case in Rwanda in 1994, when almost 1 million Rwandans were massacred by their fellows in the space of about 100 days. Rwanda had two main ethnic groups, the Tutsi and the Hutu. Both ethnic groups had their differences, but they lived together without any physical border, traded and intermarried for hundreds of years before the incursion of the Germans and the Belgians. However, everything would change for the worse when the Europeans came with their racist ideologies and infected the population. They, the Europeans, determined that the Tutsis were closer to Europeans, or white people, and as such were superior to the Hutu. At the time, the Tutsis made up less than 20% of the population of Rwanda. After the classification, the white colonizers put the Tutsis in charge, the minority in charge, and gave them all sorts of powers and privileges over the majority population, the Hutu. Naturally, this kind of arrangement where the minority is given the power and preferences and privileges over the majority was going to breed tensions in the population, something that wasn't there before the arrival of the Europeans. It was that seed of discord, that act of divide and rule, that culminated in the 1994 genocide, where the Hutu turned on the Tutsis, leaving almost 1 million dead in the space of about 3 months. Again, considering these facts, how can European contact with Africans be framed as a positive thing? In the United States, in the 1960s, the CIA and the FBI had a mandate, an actual written policy to prevent the rise of what they call a Black Messiah. The expressed objective of the program was to disrupt anything that would bring about any unity or coalition in the black community. They were literally mandated to disrupt, frame, imprison, and murder black nationalists or black revolutionaries like Marcus Garvey, Malcolm X, Martin Luther King Jr., Stokely Carmichael, Fred Hampton, and so on. These acts of sabotage and terror against black people in the US were paid for by a white government. Yet there are those who want us to see these centuries of white domination and sabotage as somehow beneficial to us. Haiti is another example of black pain that usually result when white and black histories intersect. Haiti was the first and only country in the history of mankind where slaves overpowered their quote-unquote masters and declared their own emancipation and independence. For that, Haiti, that free black republic, was deliberately, systematically, and brutally impoverished by the white establishment, namely France, the United States, and others. Haiti was destroyed to serve as an example to other black people and black nations of what will happen to them if they dared to try to liberate themselves from white oppression. Haiti was France's most lucrative colony. Now it's one of the poorest and most politically unstable countries in the world. Not because the Haitians are incompetent, but because the white establishment has made it so. And the use of terror tactics, political destabilization, and punitive economic policies to enforce and maintain the status quo of white domination is not unique to Haiti. Even a cursory review of history would reveal that most black countries have a similar story, even Jamaica, which shows that far from contributing to black people's survival, as I said before, the most regrettable event in the history of the African race was when the white world made contact with our ancestors. History is our witness that every action of the white establishment was calculated to agonize the African race. So this argument of them being indispensable to our very survival is a farce. Africans derived nothing of existential value from Europe. It was the other way around. Black people, Africans, created all civilizing concepts independently, meaning they developed all the ingredients required for social stability and advancement without the input of any other race. For example, mathematics was invented by black people. Science was invented by black people. The study of medicine was also invented by black people. The concept of a supreme being, or quote-unquote God, the development of moral codes, the concept of spirit and soul and so on, from which religion was created, all started in Africa. Africans were the first people to use language, the first people to write. Africans invented art, music, and literature. Africans invented abstract reasoning and deep thought or philosophy, the first to establish organized societies. A European telling of African history would have us believe that Africans were a quote-unquote primitive people, knowing nothing but sticks and stones. In their books, they contend that metal, for example, was introduced to the continent by Europeans, for which we should be grateful. But that is miles from the truth. Africans were the first people to smelt metal. Iron smelting started in quote-unquote sub-Saharan Africa, West Africa, thousands of years BC. And it was the British, the white man, who destroyed all of that. According to McPhee, 1926, he states, "Our investigation has shown that in the Savannah region of northern Nigeria, and indeed most part of Nigeria and West Africa in general, iron technology has been widespread and abundant for over 25 centuries. In other words, since before the coming of the Europeans, contrary to some of the early European literature to the effect that West Africans had no knowledge of iron until the arrival of the white man." The author goes on further to state that the establishment of British rule in Nigeria put an end to this once prosperous local industry. Everywhere, the inhabitants were forced to abandon the traditional art of iron smelting in favor of the cheaper iron imported from Europe. The arrival of the British did in fact destroy the industrial base much needed for Africa's technological and cultural development. Anyone who believes that white people are responsible for the survival of the black race is next level delusional. White people did not improve our civilization or gave us a civilization. They either interrupted or destroyed our existing civilizations. The foregoing points are an abbreviated list of evidence to that fact, and I have neither space nor need to enumerate other examples to prove my point. I could have included the mass incarceration of blacks in the US, Jim Crow, apartheid in South Africa and the United States, the Tuskegee experiment in the US, where for 47 years black people were injected with syphilis at health centers so experimenters or the government could understand how the disease killed people. I could have included the assassination of multiple black leaders in Africa and elsewhere for the crime of wanting to improve the lives of their citizens. The AIDS epidemic that is said to have been engineered by Western forces is not on this list. So if you're ever asked the following questions, the simple, direct answers are as follows. How would black people survive if white people didn't exist? The simple answer is, we would have survived perfectly, just as we did for thousands of years before their ancestors met ours. And if they ask you, why is there no example of a thriving, self-sustaining black community anywhere in the world? The direct, simple answer is this. There are no examples of any thriving, self-sustaining black communities anywhere in the world because white people destroyed them. Now, what do you do with this information? With this information, I hope you understand that in this current climate, white and black people can build nothing together. They have not yet attained the level of moral development to acknowledge their sins against us. They still feel as if their sins against us are justified, and they have even managed to convince some of us, well, their sins are not justifiable. And now you have the argument to articulate that position. I also hope that this information will motivate you to read, to research your history, find out from black historians who we were before we were enslaved. How did we live? What did we believe? I hope this video will have you think on these things. I'll leave it right here for now. Share the content. Tell somebody about the channel. Like the video if you like the videos. Consider subscribing to the channel. Until the next one, go thy way and love black people. Black is one. Live the revolution.